They were known in the whispers of the time as les enfants de la honte, the children of shame. For over half a century, spanning from the unchecked imperial arrogance of 1908 to the chaotic independence of 1960, a silent demographic catastrophe unfolded across the Belgian Congo. Approximately 15,000 to 20,000 children of mixed African and European heritage vanished from their communities, forcibly pried from the arms of their Congolese mothers by a colonial administration that viewed their very existence as an administrative error to be corrected. This was not a chaotic frenzy of kidnapping by rogue actors. It was a meticulous state-sponsored operation. Every abduction was documented with bureaucratic precision, stamped with official seals, and filed away in the cool, dark basements of Brussels, classified and hidden from the public eye until 2017. The tragedy of these children was not kept secret by the silence of the grave, but by the overwhelming noise of filing cabinets, the rustle of stamped decrees, and the indomitable authority of official policies written in elegant French cursive. For decades, the mothers who dared to ask for their stolen flesh and blood were met with the same terrifyingly patronizing refrain, "It is for their own good." But as we delve into the archives of Katanga province, the question that echoes through history remains unanswered. Whose good was truly being served? To understand the horror of the Métis abductions, one must first understand the stage upon which this tragedy was set. By 1923, Elizabethville, modern-day Lubumbashi, had risen from the red earth of the Katanga province like a surreal European hallucination imposed upon the African savanna. It was the crown jewel of the Belgian colonial project, a city designed to project permanence and power. Wide boulevards, meticulously lined with jacaranda trees imported from South America, dropped a carpet of purple blossoms onto the dusty streets, creating a jarring visual contrast against the copper-rich soil. The city was a physical manifestation of apartheid long before the word entered the global lexicon. It was divided with surgical precision into two distinct worlds, separated by a cordon sanitaire. On the elevated plateaus, where the breeze was fresh and the mosquitoes fewer, stood the European quarter. Here, white villas with manicured lawns and tennis courts housed the families of the colonial elite and the engineers of the Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, the massive conglomerate that drained the earth of copper, cobalt, and uranium. Below them, in the stifling heat of the valley floor, lay the Cité Indigène, the native quarter. This was a sprawling labyrinth of mud-brick homes and unpaved alleyways, a reservoir of labor for the minds and kitchens of the white masters. The separation was not just geographic, it was existential. The social hierarchy of the Belgian Congo was rigid, brittle, and obsessed with categorization. At the summit sat the colonial administrators, often young, ambitious men dispatched from Brussels on 3-year contracts, eager to secure their fortunes and enforce the civilizing mission of the crown. Beneath them were the agents territoriaux, the relentless enforcers who managed the brutal logistics of tax collection and labor quotas. Occupying a perilous purgatory were the évolués, Congolese men who had received a mission education, adopted European dress, and mastered the French language. They were held up as proof of Belgian benevolence, yet were simultaneously denied true equality, forever trapped in a dangerous middle ground. Marie-Thérèse Kawena belonged to none of these groups, yet her life was dictated by all of them. At 19 years old, she was the daughter of a Luba chief who had sent her to a Catholic mission school in a bid to secure her future. The nuns had taught her to read French and embroider lace, promising that assimilation was the bridge to a better life. Instead, that bridge led her to the domestic service of Albert Deschamps, a mining engineer from Liège. Marie-Thérèse scrubbed his floors and cooked his meals, existing in the paradoxical state of the colonial servant, hypervisible as a tool of labor, yet utterly invisible as a human being. In the claustrophobic intimacy of the colonial household, the boundaries between master and servant were often transgressed, though never with consent or equality. Albert Deschamps was a man of middling ambition but immense self-importance, a typical product of the colonial system who viewed the Congo as a playground for his desires and a ledger for his bank account. His wife, Marguerite, was a woman of sharp edges, patrolling the borders of her home with a hawk-like vigilance, determined to maintain the illusion of European propriety in the heart of Africa. But illusions are fragile things. By March of 1924, Marie-Thérèse was pregnant. In the close quarters of the Deschamps villa, the swelling of her belly was impossible to miss. Marguerite noticed immediately, her reaction a cold, simmering fury. Crucially, her anger was not directed at her husband. To acknowledge his infidelity would be to crack the facade of white moral superiority that justified their presence in the Congo. Instead, the blame was shifted entirely onto Marie-Thérèse. In the eyes of the colonial administration, the pregnancy was not a moral failing of the Belgian man, but a logistical problem caused by the African woman. The child, a Métis, represented a terrifying ambiguity. They were living proof that the racial lines were permeable, challenging the binary logic of colonizer and colonized. To the Belgian state, these children were agents of chaos who had to be managed, categorized, and ultimately removed. Marie-Thérèse gave birth to a daughter on November 3, 1924, in the native hospital, a sterile, frightening place where Congolese women labored on metal tables under the indifferent gaze of overworked Flemish nurses. She named the girl Celeste, after a teacher who had once shown her kindness. For the first 3 months of Celeste's life, Marie-Thérèse engaged in a desperate, silent war against the inevitable. She hid the infant in the servants' quarters, a cramped room behind the main house, stifling the baby's cries with her breast and singing lullabies in Luba that were barely more than breath against the child's skin. She lived in a state of high-wire anxiety, knowing that in Elizabethville, secrets were impossible to keep. The network of informants was vast. Other servants, fearful for their own positions, whispered. The Europeans, obsessed with surveillance, watched. It was an open secret that Marie-Thérèse had given birth to a light-skinned child, and the machinery of the state began to turn, slowly but with crushing weight. The problem of Céleste Deschamps had been noted in a ledger, and the solution had already been drafted in Brussels under Colonial Decree 1523. The end of Marie-Thérèse's motherhood came on a Tuesday morning in February 1925. The air was thick with the metallic tang of copper dust and the scent of blooming jacaranda when the truck from the Administration Territoriale idled outside the compound. 3 men stepped out, forming a triad of authority that encompassed every aspect of colonial control. Father Gustave Leclerc from the Mission de Saint-Joseph, representing the moral sanction of the Church. Peter Vandenberg, a territorial agent representing the cold law of the state, and a silent Congolese policeman representing the enforcement of that law upon his own people. Father Leclerc held the documents as if they were holy scripture. He spoke in rapid, legalistic French, citing the decree that granted the state guardianship over mixed-race children whose mothers were deemed morally or economically unfit, a catch-all designation applied to nearly every single Congolese mother of a Métis child. Vandenberg didn't bother with explanations. He simply extended his hand, a gesture of absolute expectation. Marie-Thérèse understood little of the legal jargon, but she understood the body language of theft. Panic, primal and overwhelming, seized her. Marie-Thérèse ran. It was a futile gesture in a city designed to entrap her, but she ran anyway, clutching Celeste to her chest, sprinting past the outdoor kitchens and into the labyrinth of drying laundry behind the house. The white sheets flapped around her like surrender flags. She made it 50 meters before the Congolese policeman caught her. He was not rough, but he was firm, whispering in Swahili, "Don't make them hurt you. They will take her anyway." The resignation in his voice was more terrifying than anger. It was the sound of a conquered people. When they pried Celeste from her arms, Marie-Thérèse let out a sound that the cook, Adisa, would later describe as the sound of a soul snapping in two, a noise devoid of language, raw and devastating. While Father Leclerc awkwardly held the screaming infant, Vandenberg produced a receipt. He forced a pen into Marie-Thérèse's trembling hand. When she couldn't steady herself to write, he marked an X on the signature line himself. He then counted out 200 francs, roughly 2 months of domestic wages, and scattered the bills on the ground around her kneeling form. It was the final insult, a transaction receipt for a human life. As the black truck drove away with her daughter, Marie-Thérèse was left in the red dust, surrounded by money she would never spend, while Marguerite Deschamps rang the bell for tea, signaling that order had been restored. The Mission de Saint-Joseph was situated 15 kilometers from the bustling center of Elizabethville, a distance calculated with specific intent. It sat at the end of a rutted dirt track, that turned into an impassable slurry of red mud during the rainy season, effectively cutting it off from the world. It was a sun-bleached purgatory, a cluster of stark, whitewashed buildings baking under the relentless Katangan sun. Ostensibly, it was an orphanage and a school. Functionally, it was a laboratory for social engineering. By 1925, the mission housed 43 children, ranging from wailing infants to bewildered 12-year-olds. They shared only two characteristics. Their skin was light enough to betray their European paternity, and they had all been severed from their mothers by the authority of the state. The perimeter of the mission was defined by a high brick wall topped with jagged shards of broken glass. The nuns claimed this fortification was necessary to keep wild animals out of the compound, but to the children inside and the mothers weeping outside, the glass served a different purpose. It was designed to keep the African world at bay, ensuring that the civilizing work happening inside could proceed without the contamination of maternal love. Inside these walls, a systematic erasure of identity was underway. The moment the heavy iron gates clanged shut behind the black truck, Celeste Kawena ceased to exist. In the mission's ledger, she was entered as Celeste Deschamps. The colonial administration applied a perverse logic to naming conventions. The children were branded with the surnames of their European fathers, men who often denied their existence, while the names of the mothers who loved them were scrubbed from the record. Her birth certificate was amended to list the mission itself as her place of origin, a bureaucratic fiction that rendered her a child of the institution rather than a child of a woman. This was the process of whitening, or indigenat, a cultural genocide designed to strip the Métis of their savage heritage. Father Leclerc, the stern administrator of Saint Joseph, viewed African blood as a spiritual and social stain that could only be cleansed through rigid discipline, French fluency, and the total rejection of indigenous culture. He saw himself not as a jailer, but as a gardener pruning away the wild branches to save the tree. Life within the mission was a regimen of enforced amnesia. The children were forbidden from speaking Swahili, Luba, or any other Congolese dialect. A slip of the tongue, a lapse into the language of their mothers, was met with swift and corporal punishment. Children were made to kneel for hours on dried corn kernels in the chapel, praying for forgiveness for their native instincts. They were dressed in stiff European clothing that chafed against the tropical heat, taught to eat with silverware, and drilled in the history of Belgium, a rainy, distant motherland they had never seen but were commanded to revere. The psychological indoctrination was even more damaging than the physical discipline. The nuns told the children a unified, devastating lie, that their mothers had abandoned them. They were told that their African mothers had given them up willingly, recognizing that they could not provide a civilized life, or that they were dead. This narrative was constructed to sever the emotional bond between child and mother, replacing it with a debt of gratitude toward the state. The older children, who still held fragmented memories of being held and loved, whispered the truth in the dark of the dormitories. But the infants like Celeste grew up believing the lie was their history. Marie-Thérèse, however, refused to accept the erasure. In the weeks following the abduction, she began the long walk to the mission. She arrived at the gates with blistered feet and a heart heavy with hope, only to be met by Sister Margareta, a Flemish nun whose face seemed permanently etched with disapproval. The interactions at the gate were a collision of two irreconcilable worlds. Marie-Thérèse pleaded in a mixture of French and Swahili for just one look at her daughter. Sister Margareta responded with the cold intransigence of the institution. "Visits are not permitted," she would say, her voice devoid of empathy. "It is for the child's adjustment. You will only confuse her." When Marie-Thérèse persisted, returning week after week, the response escalated from dismissal to threat. Father Leclerc eventually confronted her, warning that her presence constituted harassment of a religious institution. He threatened to call the Administration Territoriale to have her arrested and imprisoned. In the colonial Congo, where a black woman had no legal standing against a white priest, this was not an idle threat. It was a death sentence for her freedom. Terrified but unbroken, Marie-Thérèse changed her tactics. She stopped banging on the iron gates and instead began to prowl the perimeter of the compound like a ghost. She studied the topography of the land surrounding the mission until she found a termite mound, rising like a jagged spire from the tall grass, several hundred meters from the rear wall. From the precarious summit of this mound, if she balanced perfectly, she could see over the broken glass and into the dusty courtyard where the children were allowed recreation time. It became her ritual. Every Sunday afternoon, she would walk the 15 kilometers, climb the mound, and stand sentinel for hours. She watched a sea of children in identical white uniforms moving like distant specks. The tragedy was that infant faces morph rapidly. After months of separation, she could no longer be certain which distant figure was Celeste. Was it the child sitting alone in the shade? The one chasing a ball? The uncertainty was a torture all its own, yet she could not stay away. She soon realized she was not the only watcher. The termite mound and the surrounding rise became a gathering place for a sorority of grief. Other women began to emerge from the tall grass. Josephine, whose son Patrice had been taken at age 2. Amina, who had lost twin daughters. Beatrice, dismissed from her job the day her child was seized. They did not speak much. The weight of their shared trauma rendered language superfluous. They stood together in the red dust, a silent vigil of mothers deemed unfit by a government that measured fitness by race. They watched a world they were forbidden to enter, straining to catch a glimpse of children who were being taught to despise them. In the eyes of the Belgian administrators in Brussels, the Métis program was a resounding humanitarian success, a triumph of social order. Reports were filed praising the efficiency of the missions and the successful integration of the children into European norms. But on that hill outside Elizabethville, the reality was starkly different. It was a scene of suspended agony, a testament to a cruelty so immense it had been disguised as charity. And in her pocket, Marie-Thérèse still carried the 200 francs, the bills growing soft and worn, a burning reminder of the price placed on her daughter's head, money she swore she would never spend, for to spend it would be to accept the sale. In 1936, the monolithic silence of the Mission de Saint-Joseph developed a subtle fissure. The severe Father Lalère was recalled, replaced by Father Antoine Dubois, a man cut from a different theological cloth. Young, intellectual, and educated at Louvain, Dubois arrived with a dangerous capacity for empathy and a conscience that had not yet been calloused by colonial pragmatism. While he maintained the external discipline of the mission, he quickly sensed a rot at the core of the institution. He noticed the discrepancies in the paperwork, the evasive answers from the nuns, and the terrified silence of the children. Driven by a gnawing moral unease, Dubois began to keep a second set of records. Hidden deep within the false bottom of his desk drawer, this private leather-bound ledger became a repository for the truth. In it, he recorded not just the sterile statistics of admission, but the human debris of the system, the nightmares the children suffered, the fragmented memories of their mothers they dared to whisper, and the questions they were beaten for asking. But as he documented the daily indignities, he stumbled upon a far more sinister pattern. The children were vanishing. It was a slow, quiet hemorrhage. Dubois noticed that the disappearances followed a strict aesthetic logic. The children with the lightest skin, the straightest hair, and the most European features, those who could pass, were being systematically culled from the population. The official logs were masterpieces of vagueness, listing these departures simply as transfers for continued education or familial placement. When Dubois pressed the colonial administration for details, inquiring about the welfare of these souls, he hit a wall of polite bureaucratic stone. He was told to focus on his spiritual duties and leave the logistics to the state. But Dubois persisted, sending letters to Belgium that grew increasingly urgent. The only substantive reply he received was a chilling missive from the Director of Native Affairs, Henri Jaspard. It was a veiled threat, disguised as advice, warning the priest that the repatriation of these children was a matter of state security and racial hygiene, and that further inquiries would be considered an act of insubordination. Dubois realized then that the mission was not a sanctuary. It was a sorting facility for a human export business. Meanwhile, Marie-Thérèse had found a new kind of purgatory. After drifting through several households, dismissed for her inability to feign happiness, she was hired in 1937 by Louis Vermeire. Vermeire was an anomaly in Katanga, a widower and an accountant who preferred the company of numbers to the bloviating racism of the social clubs. He treated Marie-Thérèse with a brusque, distant respect. But he was a man who noticed things. He noticed her Sunday pilgrimages, her return at dusk with red-rimmed eyes, and the quiet dignity of her sorrow. Curiosity eventually overtook his reserve. One Sunday, He followed her to the termite mound and watched the silent vigil of the mothers. The sight of these women, staring at a wall that imprisoned their hearts, shook him. The next morning, he asked the question that broke the silence between them. "Which one is yours?" When Marie-Thérèse confessed she no longer knew, Vermeer made an offer that defied every social law of the colony. "I can find out," he said. "I know people who keep the files." Vermeer called in a favor from a corrupt clerk named Days within the colonial archives. The file Days smuggled out was a revelation of industrialized cruelty. It confirmed that Céleste Deschamps had been processed not as a child, but as a biological specimen. The documents included a medical assessment dated July 1932, detailing measurements of her skull, the width of her nose, and a color chart comparison of her skin tone. The conclusion was clinical and devastating. Suitable for European placement, minimal negroid features. Based on this biometric approval, she had been shipped to Belgium in August of that year, destined for an orphanage in Bruges. Her birth certificate had been altered to list her parents as unknown and her birthplace as Belgium. The state had not just kidnapped her, they had scientifically laundered her identity. When Vermeer read the file to Marie-Thérèse, the hope that had sustained her for 12 years finally collapsed. Her daughter was not just behind a wall, she was across an ocean, living a lie, raised to believe she had no mother. Realizing that legal recourse was impossible, the system would never return a whitened child to a Congolese mother, Vermeer proposed a different form of resistance. If they could not save the children, they would indict the system. They formed a clandestine trinity, the Belgian accountant, the Congolese mother, and eventually the rogue priest, Father Dubois. Under the cover of darkness, they began to compile a dossier of damnation. Marie-Thérèse and Vermeer interviewed the women at the termite mound, transcribing 60 distinct testimonies of abduction. Dubois contributed his secret ledger, cross-referencing the mothers' stories with the mission's deletion logs. They worked with the obsessive precision of people who knew that the truth was their only weapon. By 1939, they had built a mountain of evidence, a comprehensive map of a government program designed to strip-mine families of their children. They were no longer just grieving. They were witnesses building a case for a trial that wouldn't happen for another 80 years. In March 1939, as the storm clouds of a Second World War gathered over Europe, Louis Vermeer committed his final act of defiance. He packed the entire archive of evidence, Marie-Thérèse's heart-wrenching testimonies, the transcripts of the stolen ledger, and the biometric data of the whitening program, into a heavy parcel. He mailed it to Brussels, addressing it to Paul-Henri Spaak, a prominent journalist known for his willingness to probe the darker corners of colonial policy. For a brief moment it seemed the wall of silence might be breached. Spaak received the dossier and was reportedly shaken by the clinical depravity it exposed. He began drafting an exposé that would have shattered the benevolent image of the Belgian Empire. But the colonial apparatus was vigilant. Before a single word could be printed, Spaak received a visit from 2 agents of the Ministry of Colonies. Their message was calm, polite, and terrifyingly final. The publication of such material would threaten national security and destabilize the colony at a critical geopolitical juncture. The truth was not just suppressed, it was buried under the heavy stone of state interest. The dossier was marked classified and vanished into the archives, waiting for a generation that would care enough to read it. The backlash in Elizabethville was swift and surgical. The system did not tolerate dissent from within. In June 1939, Father Dubois was abruptly transferred to a remote mission in the Equateur province, deep in the rainforests, over 1,000 kilometers from the nearest archive or Métis child. It was an exile disguised as a reassignment, designed to silence a troublesome priest by burying him in isolation. His private ledger was confiscated during the move, swallowed by the church's own internal mechanisms of concealment. Vermeer fared no better. His contract with the mining company was terminated without explanation, and he was given 3 months to leave the Congo. He offered to smuggle Marie-Thérèse to Belgium to search for Céleste, but the logistics were impossible. A black woman traveling with a white man would have been stopped at the first checkpoint. They parted ways in a cloud of defeat. Vermeer sent letters for 3 years until the chaos of the war severed the postal lines. Marie-Thérèse never heard from him again, nor did she ever learn if he found her daughter. She was left alone with her notebooks and the aging 200-franc bills, the only tangible proof of the crime. The machinery of abduction churned on, undeterred by the war or the changing world. By the time the Congo finally wrested its independence from Belgium in 1960, the Métis program had shattered an estimated 20,000 families. The end of colonial rule brought a new, chaotic tragedy for these children. As the Belgian administration retreated, they dismantled the missions. The children who had been whitened and shipped to Belgium grew up in a vacuum of identity, raised by foster families or in orphanages, told they were the children of dead Europeans or anonymous sinners. Those left behind in the Congo found themselves in a perilous limbo, rejected by the new Congolese nationalist movement as symbols of colonial rape, yet abandoned by the Belgian fathers who had claimed to save them. They were the living remnants of a collapsed empire, citizens of nowhere, drifting in a chasm between two continents that refused to claim them. Marie-Thérèse Kawena died in 1973 in Lubumbashi, her body worn down by years of domestic labor and a grief that had calcified in her bones. She died without ever seeing Celeste's face again. Her niece, who inherited her meager possessions, found the trunk containing the notebooks and the cloth bag with the money. Unable to read the dense French cursive or understand the magnitude of the history they contained, she stored the trunk in an attic. It sat there for 40 years, a time capsule of sorrow, until 2013, when a researcher investigating the colonial era unearthed it. The documents inside provided the undeniable roadmap of the abduction network. They, along with the resurfaced records from the church archives in Belgium, formed the spine of a damning government inquiry. The silence that had begun in 1908 was finally broken, not by a shout, but by the rustle of paper from a dead woman's trunk. In 2019, the Belgian Prime Minister stood before Parliament and offered a formal apology for the segregation, abduction, and forced adoption of the Métis children. He acknowledged the systematic nature of the policy and the profound violation of fundamental human rights. It was a historic moment, broadcast globally, validating the suffering of thousands. But as the cameras flashed, a haunting reality remained. An apology cannot reverse time. It cannot decode the DNA of adults who died believing they were orphans. It cannot return the years stolen from mothers who stood on termite mounds, straining to see over walls of broken glass. The tragedy of the Métis children of the Congo serves as a chilling reminder that the greatest atrocities are often not committed in the shadows by monsters, but in broad daylight by bureaucrats, justified by laws, stamped with official seals, and executed by people who firmly believe they are doing the right thing. The 200 francs found in Marie-Thérèse's room remain the most powerful testament to this horror, a receipt for a daughter, unspent, preserving the memory of a bond that no government decree could ever truly sever.